They called it a grave, but the earth kept my children warm.
Flint Hills, Kansas, August 1872. The sun came down like a hammer on an anvil, and the prairie grass shimmered and bent under the weight of it. The sky was enormous, the kind of sky that made a man feel small and exposed, and the heat rising off the flat earth distorted the horizon into a slow liquid dance. Every homesteader in the county was building. They were hauling cottonwood logs from the creek beds, notching corners, stacking walls, driving their stakes into the hard ground, and raising their structures toward that merciless sky. Every homesteader but one. Harlow Denby was not building up. He was digging down. He had chosen a gentle swell in the land, a long rise in the prairie where the soil was firm and the drainage ran away clean to the south. He had marked his rectangle with 4 wooden stakes and a length of rope, and then he had picked up his spade and broken the earth. That was 6 weeks ago. Now the hole was 9 feet deep, 30 feet long, and 18 feet wide, and Harlow was down in the cool shadow of it, setting cottonwood sills onto a foundation of fieldstone he and his wife Philomena had hauled from the creek bed 1 wheelbarrow load at a time. From up on the rim of that great excavation, the neighbors watched. They had been watching since the second week when it became clear that Harlow was not digging a root cellar or a storm pit, but something altogether different, something deliberate and strange, and deeply unsettling to men who understood the prairie. They watched from horseback and from wagon seats and from the edges of their own fields, and what they saw made them uneasy in the way that a man becomes uneasy when he suspects another man has lost his mind, but cannot yet prove it. Ingram Lovelock was the first to ride over. He came on a bay quarter horse in the middle of a Tuesday morning, reining in at the edge of the pit and looking down with the careful measuring eyes of a man who had spent 12 years as a quartermaster for the Union Army. Lovelock understood logistics. He understood materials and weight, and the way things held together under pressure, and the way they failed. He had built supply depots across 3 states, and he knew lumber the way a doctor knows bone. He looked at what Harlow was doing, and he felt the particular discomfort of watching a competent man make a serious mistake. Harlow looked up from the pit, blinking in the sudden glare. He was a lean man, not tall, with forearms roped with muscle from years of work that most men in the county had never attempted. His face was angular and quiet, the kind of face that did not give much away. Lovelock called down to him. He said that the cottonwood Harlow was setting into the earth was greenwood porous wood, the worst possible choice for ground contact. He said it would draw moisture from the soil like a wick draws oil. He said the first spring thaw would find those sills soft and crumbling, and the structure above them would shift and settle and eventually collapse. He said it plainly without cruelty because he was a practical man, and practical men delivered their assessments directly. He finished by saying it was a waste of good timber that the whole county needed for barns and fences and corrals. Harlow listened to all of it. Then he wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand and said 4 words. The earth will hold. Lovelock sat with that for a moment. He looked at the stone foundation, at the careful placement of each rock, at the level precision of the sills Harlow had already set. He shook his head slowly, not in anger, but in something closer to sorrow, the way a man shakes his head at a promising student who has chosen the wrong answer. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward his own fields, and Harlow picked up his adze and went back to work. It was Obadiah Fenwick who came the following afternoon. Fenwick was not a man given to careful assessment or measured opinion. He was 42 years old, and he had been on the Kansas frontier for 7 years, and he had survived through force of will and a complete certainty that his way of doing things was the correct way. He had thick hands and a loud voice, and he carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never seriously questioned his own judgment. He arrived not alone, but in the casual company of 2 other men from neighboring homesteads, and he did not bother to dismount. He looked down into the pit where Harlow was working, and he said what he thought with the volume of a man performing for an audience. A real man, Fenwick said, builds his house standing on the ground. He does not burrow into the dirt like a gopher or a badger or some creature that cannot face the world above. A man who puts his family underground is not a builder. He is a gravedigger. He said this while Philomena was standing 30 feet away, hanging a washed shirt on the rope line strung between 2 stakes. She heard every word. So did Ven, who was 9 years old and sitting on a crate near the pit's edge watching his father work. So did Kel, who was 6 and was crouched in the grass nearby, examining something small and alive in the dirt. Philomena did not move. She took the next shirt from the basket and shook it smooth and pinned it to the line. Her hands were steady. Her face showed nothing. Fenwick waited a moment for a reaction, and when none came, he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and then he and his companions rode on toward the creek road. That evening, Harlow came in from the pit at dusk, washed at the basin, and sat down at the table Philomena had set for supper. They ate. The children talked about small things, a hawk they had seen, a snake in the tall grass. When the children were settled into their blankets and the lamp was turned low, Philomena cleared the table and Harlow poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the small iron stove. Philomena sat down across from him and said nothing for a while. Then she said that Fenwick had said those things in front of Ven. Harlow said he knew. She looked at her coffee cup. She said that she had agreed to this because she trusted him. She said that trust was not the same as certainty, and that she needed to know something true and specific about why they were doing what they were doing, because carrying uncertainty through a Kansas winter was harder than carrying wood. Harlow set his cup down and looked at her for a moment. Then he began to talk. He had been a sklenic in Bohemia before he was anything else. The word did not translate cleanly into English, but the closest rendering was cellar right, a man who built the underground chambers where wine fermented and aged and became what it needed to become. The work was not about wood or nails. It was about stone and earth and the slow, patient physics of the ground itself. A wine cellar had one requirement above all others: it had to hold a steady temperature of around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of what the seasons were doing above. In summer, the cellars stayed cool while the vineyards baked. In winter, they stayed above freezing while the snow piled thick on the hillsides overhead. Harlow picked up a small iron nail from the windowsill where he kept hardware sorted in a line of ceramic cups. He held it between 2 fingers. He said to think about this nail lying on the ground in the August sun. Within a few minutes, it would be too hot to touch. Its small mass could hold almost no energy without its temperature spiking immediately. Now think of a 1,000-pound boulder in the same sun. After hours of direct sunlight, the surface might feel warm, but cut into that boulder and the inside would still be cool, because the sheer mass of it could absorb enormous amounts of energy with only the smallest change in temperature. That resistance to change was what the old builders called thermal mass. The air, Harlow said, was like the nail. It had almost no mass. A sunny afternoon could be 60 degrees and that same night could fall to 20 below, and the air would follow every change instantly. But the earth was the boulder. The ground beneath the frost line 4 feet down or more held a temperature of roughly 50 degrees year-round in this part of Kansas. Not because of fire or stove or any human effort, simply because the sheer weight of it could not be moved by anything as thin and temporary as a season. Their first winter in the Cottonwood cabin, he said, had taught him something that he already knew in his hands, but had not yet translated into the language of this place. The cabin was a thermal sieve. The stove pushed heat into the room and the thin walls bled it back out into the night almost as fast as it was made. The difference between the air inside and the air outside was 80 degrees or more, and physics does not negotiate. Heat moves from warm to cold, always relentlessly, and the greater the difference, the faster it moves. They were not heating a home. They were feeding a fire that was losing a race. The buried house changed the equation entirely. 3 walls would not face the minus 10-degree night air. They would press against 50-degree earth. The temperature difference to overcome would not be 80 degrees. It would be 20. The rate of heat loss would fall by 3/4 before a single stick of wood was burned. The earth was not the enemy. The earth was the furnace that never needed feeding. Philomena listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she sat with her for a moment. She looked at the thin wall of the Cottonwood cabin, then at the small stove, then at the dark rectangle of the window where the night pressed against the glass. She said she understood. Then she said she had one condition. If the house was not finished and ready to live in by the first day of November, they would ask Reverend Norcott if the family could shelter at the church until spring. Not as defeat, but as sense. Harlow was building something no one in the county had ever built, and she was willing to stand beside that, but she would not stake the children against a deadline the earth itself had set. Harlow agreed without hesitation. Philomena looked at him for a long moment when he said it as though she was measuring something, and then she nodded once and picked up her coffee cup. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the tall grass with a sound like distant water. The following weeks had a rhythm that Harlow imposed on every project he had ever undertaken. Deliberate, methodical, without hurry, but without waste. He and Philomena spent the better part of 2 weeks hauling fieldstone from the bed of the creek, filling the wheelbarrow, pushing it up the slope to the pit, lowering the stones down on a rope cradle. The children helped where children could help, carrying the smaller pieces, keeping the water bucket full, staying out of the way when the heavy work moved. The foundation rose from the pit floor in the courses of fitted limestone 2 feet thick, 4 feet high, set with a careful mortar of Lyman Creek sand. When the wall logs went up inside the pit, Harlow worked differently than any builder in the county. He hewed each log flat on 3 sides and left the fourth rough and barked only on the interior face. He fitted them tightly at the corners, but spent less time on chinking than his neighbors would have considered adequate. The neighbors watching from the rim of the pit took this as confirmation of what they already believed: the man did not know what he was doing. Then Harlow brought out the wheelbarrow and the heavy tamping post. He began backfilling the gap between his wooden walls and the earthen banks of the pit. He shoveled the excavated soil back in, slowly tamping it down every 3 inches, with the weighted post compressing each layer before the next went on. It was the most tedious work of the entire project. It was also, to Harlow's understanding, the most important. Philomena asked him once why he could not simply fill the gap quickly and move on to the next task. He did not answer with words. He asked her to place both hands on the surface of the layer he had just finished tamping. She pressed her palms flat against it and felt the density, the unyielding solidity of it, the way it pushed back. She took her hands away and picked up a shovel. Ingram Lovelock returned in September. He came with 3 other men this time, approaching the worksite with the deliberateness of a formal delegation. He did not look at the pit from horseback this time. He dismounted, walked to the edge of the excavation, and climbed down into it. He ran his hand along the exterior of the wooden wall, then looked at the packed earth behind it. He stepped back and looked at the geometry of what Harlow had built. The 2 side walls now completely buried the long back wall pressing against its earthen bank, only the single east-facing wall still exposed to the open air. Lovelock said his piece carefully. He said that saturated soil after a heavy rain could exert hundreds of pounds of pressure per square foot against a buried wall. He said that the frost cycle, the expansion of water as it froze inside the soil, could heave and crack even heavy stone foundations. He said that what Harlow had built might stand through a dry autumn, but that the spring melt would find every weakness. He said this not as opinion, but as engineering, and he had the authority of a man who had supervised the construction of fortified supply depots in weather that would humble any Kansas winter. The 3 men behind Lovelock were watching Harlow. The whole exchange had the quality of a public proceeding. Harlow set down his shovel. He looked at Lovelock and then at the other men and then back at Lovelock. He said that in Bohemia he had built walls that held 10,000 bottles of wine for 30 consecutive years, that those walls were still standing, that they had never shifted, never cracked, never admitted a drop of water that was not precisely wanted, that he had learned to build them from men who had learned from men who had been building them since before anyone in Kansas had a grandfather. Lovelock said that this was not a wine cellar. Harlow said that he knew. He said, "This is Kansas." Harlow said nothing. He picked up his shovel and went back to work. Philomena had been standing near the east wall, and she watched her husband turn back to the tamping post and resume the slow, rhythmic compression of the earth. She watched his hands on the post. Before he lifted it for the next stroke, she saw his grip tighten briefly on the handle, the knuckles going pale for just a moment and then releasing as the post came down. No one standing at the rim of the pit saw that. Only Philomena, who was close and who had been watching her husband's hands for 11 years. October arrived with the first cold mornings and the first smell of something harder coming from the north. The mound above the pit took shape as Harlow laid the ridge poles and the rafters in the conventional manner, then departed from convention entirely. No shingles, no shakes. He covered the rafters first with a thick mat of dried prairie grass, then with the sod bricks he had carefully reserved from the original excavation, turning them upside down so that the root side faced down and the cut earth faced up. Philomena had noticed something when they first stripped the sod months earlier. The roots held the bricks together far better than the soil did, and when she suggested to Harlow that laying them root side down might cause them to knit back together. Over time, he had considered this for a long moment and then changed his method without comment. She took this as the highest form of acknowledgement he was capable of. When the last sod brick was set, Harlow climbed down off the roof and stood back and looked at what they had built. The house had disappeared. In its place was a low green mound on the prairie, unremarkable from any distance, indistinguishable from a dozen natural swells in the surrounding land. The single east-facing wall of rough cottonwood planking, with its two small windows and heavy door, was the only evidence of human construction. Above it all, a thin stone chimney rose perhaps 4 feet before ending in a simple iron cap. The neighbors called it Denby's gopher hole. They called it the Bohemian's root cellar. They said it with the casual ease of people who are certain they are right. Reverend Loman Norcott passed by on the road to the south one afternoon in late October. He was 60 yards away when he slowed his wagon and stopped it and sat looking at the mound for a long time. He was a man who read widely and thought carefully and did not form opinions quickly. He sat in his wagon with the reins loose in his hands and looked at the finished structure for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he clicked his horse forward and continued on his way without stopping. He said nothing to Harlow or Philomena, but Philomena had seen him stop and she watched him go, with the feeling that she had been observed by someone who was not yet ready to say what he had seen. 3 days before the 1st of November, Theron Joplin came to the homestead. Joplin was 36 years old, younger than most of the neighboring families, with a wife and 2 small children and a hunger about him that Harlow recognized as the hunger of a man trying to get ahead of something that was always just a little faster than he was. He came without his horse, which meant he had walked a half-mile from his place, which meant the visit was not casual. He stood outside the half-finished interior work and explained his situation plainly. His calf shelter had taken damage in the early October winds. He needed lumber to repair it before the cold came hard. He had seen the stack of cottonwood planking Harlow had trimmed from the interior framing, and he was asking to buy it. He named a fair price. Harlow told him no. He needed the remaining wood for the interior shelving and the sleeping platform and the work surface Philomena required for her kitchen area. There was not enough to share. Joplin stood with this for a moment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He said that he had not expected Harlow to be the kind of man who built his own comfort before his neighbor's survival. He said it quietly, not loudly, the way Fenwick had said his piece, which somehow made it land harder. Harlow said he was sorry about the calf shelter. Joplin nodded once, turned, and walked back down the track toward his own place without looking back. Philomena had been just inside the doorway and had heard everything. When Joplin was gone, she came outside and stood beside Harlow, and after a moment she said what she said. She said they were making enemies, Harlow. Harlow looked down the empty track where Joplin had walked. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went back inside to finish the sleeping platform. The first day of November arrived on a Thursday with a gray sky and a wind from the northwest. Harlow finished the last of the interior work the evening before. The family moved their blankets and their crates and their cooking things down into the earth for the first time as a home, not as a construction site, as the sun set behind the prairie. That night, Philomena lay on the sleeping platform with Kel warm against her side and listened to the absolute silence of the place. The wind was up outside. She knew this because she had heard it when Harlow went to check the livestock an hour before the sound of it rushing over the grass and throwing itself against the prairie without mercy. But in here there was nothing. Not the moan of timber under pressure, not the hiss of cold air finding a crack in the chinking, not the constant, faint percussion of a structure arguing with the weather around it. Just stillness and warmth that asked for nothing in return. Philomena looked up at the ceiling of packed earth above her and thought the thought she had been keeping back for months, the thought she had agreed not to say out loud. She thought, what if he is wrong? She let herself think it fully and completely, the way you must face a fear to measure its actual size. And then she lay there in the warmth and the silence and felt the question slowly lose its urgency, not because she had answered it, but because the evidence of her own body was beginning to speak louder than the doubt. Outside, the grass bent and the wind drove hard across the empty plain. Inside the mound, a candle burned on the shelf without flickering. The first real test came not from the cold, but from the warmth. Philomena had developed a habit in those early December weeks that she did not name and did not discuss with Harlow. Each morning before the children woke, she rose in the dark and crossed to the east door in her wool socks and opened it. Not wide, just enough to feel what was outside pressing against what was inside. She held the door open for 3 seconds, sometimes 4, and then closed it and stood in the middle of the room with her eyes shut. She was measuring, not the temperature, which she had no instrument to record precisely. She was measuring the contrast, the way the outside air felt against her face versus the way the room received her when she turned back into it. She did this every morning for 2 weeks, and no one knew she was doing it except Kel, who woke early and watched from her blankets with the patient, unblinking attention of a 6-year-old who understands more than she is given credit for. On the morning of the 15th day, Philomena opened the door, held it for her, 3 seconds, closed it, and stood in the middle of the room. Then she went to the stove and began making the morning coffee without performing her usual stillness afterward. Kel watched her mother move to the stove with the unhurried ease of a woman who has settled something privately and does not need to announce it. The child pulled her blanket up to her chin and went back to sleep. Philomena had stopped measuring because there was nothing left to doubt. Not because Harlow had argued her into certainty, because her own body had stopped asking the question. December deepened. The light came low and pale over the prairie each morning and left early each afternoon, and the cold settled in with the patient permanence of a long-term tenant. Harlow kept the small iron stove fed 3, sometimes 4 times a day. He had cut and stacked his winter wood in the stone alcove he had built into the north interior wall, and the stack decreased slowly, so slowly that he began keeping a tally on a strip of birch bark he kept on the shelf beside the lamp. Each morning he marked what had been burned. Each morning the number was smaller than he had expected. Reverend Loman Norcott came on a Tuesday in the middle of December, arriving on foot, because the road from town was soft with the early cold, and he preferred to walk when he was thinking. He was a tall man with a gray beard in the hands of someone who had done physical labor before he found his vocation, and he moved through the world with the unhurried deliberateness of a person who believes that observation is a form of respect. He knocked. Philomena let him in. He sat at the table and accepted the coffee she poured and looked around the room with the careful attention he brought to everything, the same attention he gave to a passage of scripture he had read 100 times and expected to find new. He looked at the walls. He looked at the children. He looked at the small pile of ash in the stove grate that Philomena had not yet cleared from the previous evening. He sat with his coffee for 20 minutes and said very little, and what he did say was about the congregation in the early winter and whether the Joplin family had enough put up for the cold months. When he stood to go, he picked up his coat from the peg and paused with it in his hands. He asked Harlow, as if the question had just occurred to him, how much wood the family had burned in the past week. Harlow went to the shelf and brought down the birch bark strip and handed it to him. Norcott looked at the numbers for a long moment. His face did not change in any dramatic way. He handed the strip back and nodded once, the slow nod of a man filing information in a precise location. Then he put on his coat. At the door he turned and looked at Philomena with an expression that was not quite a smile. He said that her children looked well. Philomena understood that this was not a pleasantry. A man like Norcott did not offer pleasantries. He offered observations, and he offered them precisely. She stood in the doorway and watched him walk back across the frozen ground toward the road, and she did not move until he had gone from sight. Behind her, Kel asked if the Reverend was coming back. Philomena said she believed he was. January arrived with a deception. For the first 4 days of the new year, a wind came up from the southwest, warm and dry, and smelling of something almost like spring, a chinook rolling down off the distant mountains and spreading itself across the plains with the extravagant generosity of a false promise. The temperature climbed into the high 50s. The snow that had dusted the prairie softened and ran in thin, dark lines across the frozen ground. The grass emerged from its white covering in patches, brown and matted, but there. In the conventional cabins spread across the Flint Hills, the warmth outside did a particular kind of damage. The log walls that had been frozen solid for weeks began to release their moisture as the exterior temperatures rose. Water worked into the chinking, the carefully packed clay and lime mix that sealed the gaps between the logs, and the chinking swelled and softened. On the interior ceiling beams of the Fenwick house, condensation gathered and dripped. Cressida Fenwick spread a canvas tarpaulin under the worst of it and moved her flour and her dried goods to the driest corner of the room. At the Lovelock homestead, Vesper Lovelock found a line of dark moisture along the base of the north wall, where the chinking had worked loose and the thawed wood had wept. Inside the Denby house, the 4 days of warmth went nearly unnoticed. The earth surrounding 3 walls and the entire roof was too massive, too slow, too indifferent to respond to 4 days of mild air. The interior temperature did not rise significantly. The interior temperature did not drop significantly. The air remained dry. The walls did not weep. Philomena hung the family's washing on the line strung across the interior, and it dried within a few hours in the still temperate air. On the third day of the Chinook, Theron Joplin rode past on the creek road and saw Philomena outside the east door shaking out a rug in the mild afternoon air. He pulled his horse up without meaning to, or so it appeared from the outside. He sat on his horse at a distance of perhaps 40 yards and looked at her and then at the mound of earth behind her and then at her again. Philomena looked back at him. She did not wave and she did not call out. After a moment, Joplin clicked his horse forward and rode on toward the creek. Philomena watched him until he turned south at the junction and disappeared. Then she went back inside. On the fifth day, the wind turned. It came from the north this time, and it came without preparation or announcement. The temperature that had touched 58 degrees at noon fell 20 degrees by 4 in the afternoon and kept falling. The wet ground froze where it stood, capturing the last shapes of the thaw boot prints, wheel ruts, the splayed imprints of cattle hooves, all of them locked suddenly into iron permanence. The puddles that had formed in the low spots of the fields turned to black glass so clear you could see the grass stems suspended inside them, like insects in amber. By morning, the Flint Hills were encased. Every surface wore a layer of clear ice thick in the low places and thin on the exposed rises, but everywhere present and everywhere treacherous. Each blade of grass stood sheathed in its own transparent sleeve. The branches of the cottonwoods along the creek clinked faintly against each other in the wind, a sound like distant breaking china. Travel on foot was difficult. Travel by wagon was dangerous. Travel by horseback required a horse willing to pick its way with extreme care across a surface that offered no purchase to ironclad hooves. The cold that followed was not the ordinary cold of a Kansas January. It had a different quality, a penetrating, settled, absolute cold that came from a sky that had gone a particular shade of white that old-timers recognized and did not like. The sun rose each day and provided light, but no warmth, a lamp without heat, and the world beneath it contracted and hardened further. The families of the Flint Hills understood within 2 days that this was not a passing cold snap. This was a siege. Inside their cabins, the damage done by the brief thaw compounded itself. The chinking that had softened and swelled was now frozen in its weakened state, cracked in new places, admitting the cold in new ways. The cottonwood logs themselves, having absorbed moisture during the warm days, were now conducting the cold more efficiently than they had before the thaw. Fires that had been adequate in early December were no longer adequate. Wood supplies that had seemed sufficient began to look less certain. Obadiah Fenwick, who had burned wood at a rate that satisfied his pride in the size of his fire, found himself calculating. He had 2 boys old enough to help split and carry, and he set them to work before dawn each morning. His wife Cressida kept the fire going through the night in shifts, sleeping in the chair by the stove and waking herself every 2 hours. The corners of their bedroom where the 2 smallest children slept were white with frost each morning, regardless. Harlow climbed to the top of the mound on the morning of the 3rd day of the siege. He had business there, checking that the ice load on the sod roof was not causing any unusual stress on the ridge poles, pressing his hands against the surface to feel for any soft places where the frost might be working in. He worked his way across the roof, methodically pressing and listening, and found nothing to concern him. The sod was frozen solid on the exterior, but the interior of the roof was as stable as the day he had finished it. When he had finished his inspection, he stood upright on the mound and looked out across the Flint Hills. The ice had transformed the landscape into something austere and strange, beautiful in the way of things that do not care whether you find them beautiful. He could see the smoke from 5 neighboring homesteads from where he stood, thick columns of gray rising and bending in the wind. He looked at his own chimney, which was visible as a low protrusion a few feet from where he stood. The smoke from it was thin and pale, rising with the unhurried consistency of a fire that was not working hard. He thought about Fenwick, not with satisfaction, not with the particular pleasure of a man whose critics have been proven wrong, but with something more complicated. He thought about the way Fenwick had said what he said in front of Ven. He thought about the particular quality of cruelty that does not recognize itself as cruelty because it is wrapped in the language of common sense. He stood on the frozen roof of his buried house with the wind moving across him, and he let himself feel the thing he had not permitted himself to feel through all the months of work and doubt and silent pressure. He felt the solidity beneath his feet. He had built this. He had built it correctly, and it was working. He did not shout this or speak it or even fully form it into words. He simply stood on the mound in the bitter air and let the knowledge move through him the way warmth moves through a body that has been cold too long. Then he climbed back down and went to check on the livestock. The night arrived early and brought the worst cold yet. Harlow came in from the barn at 7 in the evening and stood at the basin long enough to feel his fingers again before sitting down to supper. Philomena had made a soup from dried beans and the last of the salt pork, thick and hot, and the children ate it without complaint, which in winter was the same as eating it with gratitude. After the children were asleep, Harlow sat at the table with the birch bark tally strip and his stub of pencil and marked the day's wood. Philomena was mending by lamplight, her needle moving through the heavy canvas of Ven's work pants, in the unhurried rhythm she always fell into when her hands were busy and her mind was somewhere else. Harlow set down the pencil and sat for a moment. Then he rose quietly and went to the wooden box he kept under the sleeping platform, the box that held his good tools and his few documents and the things he had carried from Bohemia. He lifted out a small object wrapped in oilcloth and set it on the table. Philomena looked up. He unwrapped it. The thermometer was iron-old, the markings etched rather than painted, the kind of instrument made to last rather than to be pretty. He had owned it for 17 years. He had used it to verify every cellar he had ever built. He had not taken it out since they moved into the house because he had told himself he did not need it. He had been telling himself this not because it was true, but because taking it out meant admitting that some part of him was still uncertain, and he had not been ready to admit that. He crossed to the north wall. The wall pressed deepest into the earth and held the thermometer against it. He waited. The lamp cast a long shadow of him across the ceiling. Philomena watched without speaking. He read the temperature, 53 degrees. He walked to the center of the room and held the thermometer in the open air. He waited, 67 degrees. He stood in the middle of the room with the instrument in his hand, and the number settled in his chest like something that had been waiting a long time to land. Philomena set down her mending. She came to stand beside him, and she looked at the thermometer, and then she looked at his face. What she saw there was not triumph. It was something quieter and older than triumph. It was the expression of a man who has carried a weight for so long that he has forgotten what it felt like not to carry it and has only now set it down. Harlow said it very quietly. He said that in Bohemia he had known. He had built those cellars with the absolute certainty of a craftsman working within a tradition that had been proven over generations. Here he said he had not been certain. Not truly. Not until tonight. Philomena did not offer him comfort or reassurance. She had not been built for that kind of response, and neither had he. Instead, she took the thermometer from his hand and held it herself, feeling the weight of it, and then she set it carefully on the shelf beside the lamp, where they could both see it. She sat back down and picked up her mending. Harlow sat back down at the table. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the ice-covered prairie made no sound at all. 3 days later, the siege showed no sign of breaking. Ingram Lovelock had been watching his cattle with the careful attention of a man who understood that cattle were capital, and capital kept a family alive. The ice had locked the grass beneath a layer his herd could not break through. He had hay cut and stacked in a rick a quarter-mile from the barn, but he had been rationing it against the possibility of a longer winter than he had provision for. Now, with the cold showing no intention of releasing, he made the calculation that every man of practical sense eventually makes the certain loss of waiting was worse than the uncertain risk of acting. He hitched his 2 strongest horses to the hay wagon on the morning of the 5th day. His wife, Vesper, stood at the barn door and watched him work and said nothing because she was a woman who understood the arithmetic of a frontier winter and understood also that there were decisions a man had to be permitted to make himself. The horses moved across the frozen pasture with the careful, stiff-legged gait of animals that did not trust the surface. Lovelock sat high on the wagon seat and kept his weight centered and drove slowly, letting the horses pick their way. He reached the hayrick without incident and loaded the wagon with the focused efficiency of a man working against cold and time. He tied the load and turned the horses for home. On the long slope that ran down toward the barn, the ice was smoother, polished by 2 days of wind into a surface like pale green glass. The horses felt it change under their feet and slowed without being asked. Lovelock felt the wagon begin to travel faster than the horses, the weight of the hay load pushing forward, and he set the brake. The brake caught nothing. The iron shoe found no purchase on the glazed surface. The wagon moved sideways. The horses scrambled their shod hooves, striking bright sparks off the ice and finding nothing to push against. The right rear wheel dropped into a rut that the thaw had opened, and the freeze had locked in place, hidden under the ice like a trap. The axle, good oak, 3 inches thick, took the torque of the shifting load and the sliding mass of the wagon and snapped with a sound that crossed the frozen field like a rifle shot. The wagon dropped and tilted, and the hay load shifted, and Lovelock came off the seat sideways and caught himself on the side rail. The horses stopped pulling. There was nothing to pull. There was a broken wagon sitting at an angle on an iced hillside with a man standing beside it in a wind that was reading 15 degrees and falling. Lovelock stood still for a moment and took stock of his situation with the methodical calm of a man who has learned that panic costs time you do not have. He looked at his own homestead. It was a long walk across open ice, and the wind was directly in his face going that direction, and he was not dressed for a long walk because he had not intended to be outside for more than an hour. He looked at the Joplin place to the southeast. Too far. He looked north toward the Fenwick homestead, also too far in the wrong direction. He looked west. 200 yards away, half buried in the ice-covered prairie, a low mound of earth wore a thin cap of frozen sod and exhaled a thread of pale smoke into the white sky. Lovelock stood beside his ruined wagon and looked at that smoke for a long time. He was a man who kept careful accounts. He knew what he had said at the edge of that pit in August. He knew what he had said in September with 3 men standing behind him. He was not a man who had revised his public positions easily or quickly, and he was not a man who had been wrong often enough to have developed a comfortable relationship with the experience. The wind found the gap between his collar and his hat and delivered its opinion on the matter. Lovelock pulled his coat tighter and began walking toward the smoke. He crossed the ice field with the stiff, careful steps of a man whose pride was still arguing with his survival instinct and losing badly. He reached the single wooden wall of the earth house and stood before the door. His hands were beginning to lose sensitivity in the fingertips. His face was tight and numb across the cheekbones. He raised his fist and unknocked. The door opened. Harlow Denby stood in the doorway with the warm, dark interior of the house behind him, and the light from the interior lamps fell out across Lovelock's face, and for just a moment, neither man said anything. Harlow looked at Lovelock's face and read what was written there: the cold, the pride, the particular quality of a man who has come somewhere he did not expect to need to come. He stepped to the side without a word. Lovelock stepped across the threshold. What happened to him then was not something he would have been able to predict or prepare for, because no amount of intellectual understanding about soil temperature and thermal mass and the principles of underground construction could have prepared him for the physical reality of stepping out of a Kansas January and into 50 degrees of still, dry, effortless warmth. The transition was not gradual. It was immediate and total, the way a door closes between 2 entirely different worlds. He stood just inside the threshold and did not move. The air did not move around him. There were no drafts, no cold seeping up from the floor, no chill radiating from the walls. The warmth was not the aggressive fire-forward heat of a stove-centered room with cold pressing in from every other direction. It was ambient, pervasive. It came from everywhere and from nowhere, and it asked nothing of him except to stand in it. Philomena was at the table with a ball of dough in front of her, the heels of her hands pressing into it with the slow, steady rhythm of bread work. Ven was reading on the floor near the lamp. Kel was drawing something on a piece of brown paper with a stub of charcoal. The children were wearing their shirt sleeves. Lovelock looked at the children in their shirt sleeves, and something moved across his face that was not quite any single identifiable emotion. Then he saw the shelf. It was carved directly into the packed earth wall, a simple ledge of hardened soil, smooth and level. On it sat a round of bread dough covered by a square of clean linen. The linen was tented upward in the middle. The dough beneath it was rising. Lovelock stood still and looked at that linen-covered mound, and his mind worked through what he was seeing with the systematic precision that had made him an effective quartermaster and a respected man in the county. He had been in enough frontier homes in enough winter conditions to know the simple truth about bread dough in cold weather. Yeast was a living thing. Cold stopped it. In the homes he knew in December and January, bread dough did not rise on a shelf. It sat inert and cold and needed to be coaxed for hours near the fire before it would respond. He had watched Vesper work the dough close to the stove, with her hands warming it slowly back into activity because the room temperature alone was never enough. This dough was not near the fire. It was on a shelf of bare earth, and it was rising with the steady, unhurried confidence of dough that had never been interrupted. Lovelock reached up slowly and removed his hat. He had not meant to do it. The gesture came from somewhere below. Conscious intention, the same place that takes a hat off in a church or beside a grave. The place in a man that recognizes when he is standing in the presence of something that exceeds his previous understanding. Philomena glanced up from the dough and saw Lovelock standing with his hat in his hand looking at the shelf. She looked at Harlow. Harlow was looking at Philomena. In the brief exchange of that look was everything that had passed between them since that first winter night when he had explained his plan to her in a cold cottonwood cabin with their son's cracked boots on the floor between them. Lovelock said, his voice rough from the cold and from something else, the dough, "It is rising." Harlow said, "It is warm." Lovelock sat at the table for a long time. Philomena poured chicory coffee into a clay cup and set it before him and went back to her bread without comment. Harlow sat across from him. Neither man spoke for several minutes, and the silence between them was not the silence of two men who have nothing to say, but the silence of two men who are letting something very large settle into its proper place before they attempt to put words around it. Lovelock wrapped both hands around the cup. The warmth moved up through his palms and into his wrists, and he felt his fingers begin to return to him one by one. He looked at the cup, he looked at the table surface, smooth cottonwood planking, and at the lamp burning without a flicker. He looked at the children. Ven had gone back to his reading. Kel had stopped drawing and was watching Lovelock with the open, unembarrassed curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she is not watching. Lovelock looked at the shelf. The dough had continued its work while he sat there. The linen was tented higher now than when he had come in. He drank the coffee slowly. He was a man who processed the world through what he could measure and verify, and right now he was measuring the warmth against his skin and verifying it against everything he had told himself over the past 6 months, and the accounting was not coming out in his favor. He had said green cottonwood would rot. He had said the soil pressure would collapse the walls. He had said the frost cycle would crack the foundation. He had brought other men with him to lend authority to his assessment. He set the cup down. He reached inside his coat and drew out a small, leather-covered notebook, the kind issued to Union Army quartermasters for field accounting. The cover was worn smooth at the corners from years of use. He set it on the table and pushed it across to Harlow. He said he needed the dimensions. Foundation depth wall, thickness, roof layers, all of it. He would pay for the time. Harlow looked at the notebook. He looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then he looked at Lovelock. He pushed the notebook back across the table, not roughly, just firmly, a deliberate return. He rose and went to the shelf beside the lamp and picked up the birch bark tally strip he had been marking since November. He came back and set it down in front of Lovelock in place of the notebook. He said the numbers were already there. Lovelock picked up the strip of birch bark. He held it close to the lamp and read the markings, the daily wood consumption tallied in Harlow's small, careful hand across the pale surface of the bark. He read it twice. A man with his experience in logistics knew immediately what those numbers meant. He knew what it cost in wood to keep a conventional cabin at a survivable temperature in the kind of cold that had been sitting on the Flint Hills for 2 weeks. He knew the difference between what those numbers said and what they should have said. He folded the birch bark strip once and held it in his hand. He did not give it back. Harlow helped him unhitch the horses from the broken wagon when the cold had left Lovelock's hands enough to make the work possible. They did it together in the dusk, working with the economical cooperation of two men, performing a practical task, not talking much, passing the harness, buckles, and the lead ropes back and forth, with the wordless efficiency that physical work sometimes creates between people who have been at odds. The broken wagon would stay where it was until the ground thawed enough to drag it. The horses were walked back to Lovelock's barn, and Harlow watched until Lovelock had them inside and the barn door closed. Then he walked back across the frozen field to the mound in the dark. 3 days into the second week of the siege, Philomena found the marks. She had gone out early in the morning before the children were up, intending to check that the water barrel on the east side of the house had not frozen solid overnight. She was moving along the base of the exterior wall when she saw them in the crust of old snow that had accumulated against the foundation. Boot prints. They came from the direction of the creek road, approached the east wall to within a few feet of the small window there, and then turned and went back the way they had come. The prints were not fresh. They were from the previous night, frozen into the crust in sharp relief by the hard cold that followed. Someone had come to the wall of their house in the dark and stood there, and then walked away without knocking. She studied the prints for a moment. They were smaller than Lovelock's boots. She looked toward the Joplin homestead, which was visible as a dark shape a half-mile distant, with a thin line of smoke above it, thinner than it should have been. She went back inside. Harlow was at the stove. She told him what she had found. He listened without turning around. He poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on the table for her and stood at the window that looked east and drank his in silence. After breakfast, he saddled the horse. The Joplin homestead looked worse than it had from a distance. The calf shelter Joplin had been trying to repair in October was listing to one side, one corner post having failed in the freeze. Near the woodpile, which was dramatically smaller than it should have been at this point in winter, Joplin himself was sawing lengths of board from the side wall of an old hog pen, the kind of wood a man burns only when he has burned everything else first. His breath came in hard white clouds. He did not look up when Harlow rode in. Harlow dismounted and stood for a moment watching him work. Joplin kept sawing. The saw moved through the old dry wood with the mechanical persistence of a man trying to accomplish something without acknowledging the person watching him. Harlow said, "Bring your family." Joplin set the saw down on the board and straightened up. He looked at Harlow with an expression that contained several things at once: exhaustion and pride, and the particular resentment of a man who knows he is in a position he should not be in and blames himself for it. He said they were fine. Harlow looked at the diminished woodpile. He looked at the hog pen boards. He looked at the thin smoke coming from the cabin chimney, the smoke of a fire burning small and carefully because the wood that fed it had to last. He said, "You are not fine. Come tonight." Joplin said nothing for a moment. Then he said he owed Harlow nothing. Harlow said he knew that. The 2 men stood in the cold looking at each other, and the wind moved between them carrying nothing helpful. Then Harlow remounted and turned for home without saying anything further. He had said what needed saying. The rest was not his to decide. The Joplin family arrived that evening at dusk. There was no announcement. The knock came while Philomena was setting the supper things, and Harlow opened the door to find Joplin standing there with his wife Gwyneth and their 2 children, a boy of perhaps 7 and a girl younger than Kel. They had a bundle, each blankets, and a few provisions. No one offered an explanation, and no one asked for one. Philomena had rearranged the sleeping area in the hour since Harlow returned, a fact she accomplished without discussion or instruction, working from the simple premise that if Harlow had gone to say, "Come tonight," then someone was coming tonight. The house held 8 people. It was not built for 8 people. The children sorted themselves with the instinctive spatial logic of children and found their arrangement quickly. The adults were more careful with each other, moving around the table and the stove with the measured courtesy of people sharing a space that requires goodwill to function. Joplin sat through supper without speaking more than was required. He ate steadily and helped his children settle, and then sat by the wall with his back against the packed earth and his eyes somewhere in the middle distance. He did not look at Harlow directly. Harlow did not press him out too. Philomena kept the conversation at the practical level that suited the occasion, the children's arrangements, the morning water, whether anyone needed more in their bowl. Later, when the children were all asleep and Gwyneth Joplin had dozed off in the chair by the stove, Joplin sat in the quiet and looked around the room with the slow attention of a man taking inventory. He looked at the walls. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the shelf where the thermometer now sat permanently, and at the small stove burning its measured, unhurried fire. He looked at his own children sleeping warm in their blankets on the floor of a house that had been called a grave. He did not say anything, but something in the set of his shoulders changed over the course of that evening, some resistance that had been held rigid for months, releasing in the slow, incremental way that ice releases when the conditions finally change. Harlow noticed. He said nothing about it. He banked the fire for the night and went to sleep. The siege broke in the second week of February. It did not end dramatically. It simply stopped the way a long illness sometimes stops, the temperature rising a few degrees over 2 days and then a few more, the ice beginning to lose its certainty, the glaze thinning and cracking in the sun. The ground remained frozen, but the air above it began to negotiate. By the third week of February, a man could walk without sliding, and by the 1st of March, the mud had returned with the particular enthusiasm of Kansas mud in early spring. Reverend Loman Norcott came on a Tuesday morning in the first week of March, walking as was his custom when he was thinking. He carried his church registry under his arm, the heavy volume with its bison leather cover, where he recorded the births and deaths and marriages of his congregation. He sat at the table with Harlow and Philomena, and a pot of coffee between them, and opened the registry to the blank pages at the back. He asked his questions methodically, in the order of a man who had been composing the questions for some time, and was now simply delivering them. Harlow answered each one precisely. When Norcott asked about the sod roof, Philomena put down her coffee cup and answered instead, explaining the inverted laying of the bricks and the reason for it, the way the root structure drew the soil downward and created a cohesion the cut face could not provide. Norcott made a note. He added a small question mark beside it. Philomena leaned across the table and erased the question mark with her thumb. Norcott looked at the smudge where the mark had been, then at Philomena. He picked up his pencil and added a period in its place. Then he continued. When he stood to go, he paused at the door in the way he had before, the pause of a man with one more thing. He looked at Harlow and said that the first person who had asked him about this house was not Ingram Lovelock. It was Obadiah Fenwick, 3 weeks before Lovelock's wagon broke. Harlow stood very still. Norcott said this without elaboration or editorial, the way he delivered most information, simply placing it where it could be considered. Then he put on his coat and left. Philomena sat at the table after he had gone. She had not moved since Norcott said Fenwick's name. She looked at the space on the table where the registry had been open, then at Harlow, then back at the table. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty and set it down again. She said 3 weeks. Harlow said nothing. He was looking at the door. She said it again, not to Harlow, but to herself, working through what it meant. Obadiah Fenwick, who had stood at the rim of the pit in August and said what he said in front of the children in a voice loud enough to carry. Obadiah Fenwick had been asking Reverend Norcott about this house in November, while the ground was still freezing, while the winter was still only a threat. He had been asking privately away from the audience that had heard him mock it publicly in the way a man asks about something he does not want to be seen asking about. A week after Norcott's visit, on a Tuesday afternoon when the light was coming in low and yellow through the 2 east windows, someone knocked at the door. Harlow was at the work table and Philomena was near the stove. Harlow opened the door. Obadiah Fenwick stood outside with his hat in both hands. He was not on horseback. He had walked. His boots were muddy to the ankle from the spring thaw, and his coat was open despite the cold, the coat of a man who has been walking fast enough to work up heat. He looked at Harlow and then past Harlow at the interior of the room and then back at Harlow. He did not say he was sorry. He did not say anything that used the word wrong or mistake or apology. He stood with his hat in his hands for a moment, and then he asked if Philomena's husband was home. Philomena, from inside, he is. Another moment. The wind moved through the gap between them. Fenwick's jaw worked once. Then he said he wanted to ask about the foundation depth. Harlow stepped back from the door. They sat at the table. Fenwick put his hat on his knee, and Harlow poured coffee without being asked and set a cup in front of him. They talked for an hour. Fenwick asked his questions carefully, not the questions of a man trying to win an argument or cover his embarrassment, but the focused questions of a man who is genuinely trying to understand something he has decided he needs to know. He asked about the depth of the stone foundation and the method of fitting the courses. He asked about the direction of the roof drainage and how Harlow had managed the water coming off the sod in the spring melt. He asked about the east wall framing the only wall exposed to the weather and whether the cottonwood had held. Harlow answered each question as he would answer any honest question, directly and completely, without surplus and without withholding. When Fenwick stood to go, he put his hat back on and picked up his coat from the peg Philomena had hung it on. He turned toward the door, and then he stopped and looked at Philomena. He looked at her the way a man looks at someone when he has something to say and is deciding whether he has the right to say it. He said, "Your children look well, Mrs. Denby." He went out before she could answer. Philomena stood in the middle of the room and listened to his boots on the hard ground outside until they faded. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she sat back down at the table and picked up the work she had set aside when he knocked, and she pulled it toward her, and her hands were not quite steady on the first stitch. Harlow was watching her. She looked up and found his eyes and held them for a moment. Then she looked back down at the work in her hands. By the time the ground had thawed enough to dig, Norcott's registry drawings were in the hands of 3 families. He had made them available at the church with the simple announcement that anyone interested in the construction principles of the Denby Earth House could examine the drawings and notes in the back of the registry. He said nothing else about it. He did not advocate or explain. He simply made it known that the information existed and was available to anyone who wanted it. Ingram Lovelock had begun his excavation in the 3rd week of March as soon as the frost line dropped enough to work. He had the tally strip. He had the hour he had sat in the house with his coat off and his hands around a cup of coffee while the dough rose on the shelf. That was sufficient for a man of Lovelock's practical nature. Vesper Lovelock came to visit Philomena on a Thursday afternoon in late March, when the first green was coming up through the mud and the mound above the Denby house was beginning to show the tiny yellow flowers that had seeded themselves in the sod over the winter. She brought a sack of flour as a gift and sat outside with Philomena in the thin spring sun, the 2 women on upturned crates with the warmth of the afternoon on their faces. Vesper said that Ingram was already 3 feet down on the north side. She said he was moving faster than he should, and she had concerns about the foundation coursing. Philomena said to tell him heavier posts for tamping. She said the 3rd layer down was the one that mattered most. The layer that other men rushed through because they could not feel the difference between adequate and sufficient, and the difference was everything. Vesper took a dried stem of grass from the ground beside her crate and wrote the words on her palm. 3rd layer, heavy post. Philomena watched her write and felt something she had not expected to feel, something that had been waiting under all the months of doubt and endurance and the small daily acts of holding things together. It was not pride exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the feeling of a woman who has done something real, something that worked, something that will be carried forward by other hands into other winters she will never see. She looked at the yellow flowers on the roof of her buried house. She looked at Vesper writing on her palm with a dried grass stem in the pale spring sun. She did not say anything about what she was feeling because she did not need to. Theron Joplin came on an afternoon in early April when the mud had firmed enough to make walking across the fields possible without losing a boot at every step. He came alone without his wife, which meant the visit was intentional. He stood outside the east wall and called Harlow's name, rather than knocking, which was also intentional, the approach of a man who wants to be able to walk away if the door does not open warmly. Harlow came out and stood in the afternoon light. Joplin stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the mound of earth and its flowers, and then at Harlow. He said he was thinking about building on the east side of his creek lot, where the stone was close to the surface, and the bank ran nearly 4 feet deep on the north face. He asked whether that would work for what Harlow had done, or whether the proximity to the creek was a problem for the foundation. Harlow considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. He said the shallow stone was an advantage, that it reduced the foundation labor considerably. He said the creek proximity was a concern only if the drainage ran toward the structure rather than away, and that the first thing to establish was the direction of the spring runoff from that bank. He said the north face being 4 feet deep was nearly ideal for the load-bearing wall, that the depth provided more stable earth temperature than a shallower burial, and the mass would be greater. Joplin listened to this and nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came to your window that night and I did not knock." Harlow looked at him. Joplin said he did not know why he had not knocked. He said he had stood there in the dark with his hand raised and then put it down and walked back. He said he had thought about it since, and he still did not have a good accounting for it, except that there was something in him that night that was not ready to need what he knew was on the other side of that wall. Harlow stood with that for a moment. Then he said, "You knocked tonight." Joplin looked at him for a moment, and then he looked at the mound with its flowers and the thin thread of smoke from the chimney above it. He nodded once, a single slow nod, the nod of a man who has completed something he needed to complete. Then he asked what Harlow thought about setting the sill logs on a rubble stone course versus a mortared course, given the spring water table near the creek. And Harlow told him, and they talked for another half hour in the spring afternoon about stone and earth and the particular patience that building underground required. 7 copies of Norcott's drawings existed by the end of April. 3 families were digging. The knowledge that had come from the wine cellars of Bohemia was moving through the Flint Hills in the way that genuinely useful knowledge always moves, not through proclamation or argument, but through the quiet passage of a drawing from one hand to another, through a woman writing on her palm with a grass stem, through two men standing in the mud talking about stone courses and drainage. That summer, on a July afternoon, when the heat was doing its work on the prairie again, and the grasshoppers were loud in the tall grass, Ven sat on a fence rail watching his father work the field with the horse and the turning plow. The boy had his father's quality of patient observation, the ability to watch a thing for a long time without needing to comment on it. After a while, he called out to Harlow and asked why everyone had said their house was a grave. Harlow stopped the horse. He turned and looked at his son sitting on the fence rail in the July heat with the serious face of a 9-year-old who is asking a question he has been holding for a while. Harlow said, because they did not know what the ground knew. Ven thought about this with the visible, effortful concentration of a child taking something seriously. Then he asked what the ground knew. Harlow looked at the field in front of him, at the dark turned soil and the heat shimmering above the unturned grass beyond the fence line, at the sky that went on in every direction without apology. He said that winter is thin, and underneath it everything is warm. Ven sat with this. Then he nodded in the way his mother nodded when something settled into place, a single slow nod that did not require any further response. He jumped down from the fence and went back toward the house, which from the outside still looked like nothing more than a gentle rise in the earth, with a wooden face turned east and a thin line of smoke rising from a stone chimney into the blue Kansas sky. A century after Harlow Denby set his first cottonwood sill onto a stone foundation 9 feet below the prairie, the engineers of the 1970s found themselves in a different kind of crisis. Not the crisis of a brutal winter, but the crisis of the energy that heat required. They went looking for answers, and they found, as people often find when they look carefully enough, that the answers had been there for a very long time. They gave new names to what they found: passive geothermal, thermal inertia, earth-sheltered construction. The principles underneath those names were the same principles that a Bohemian cellar right had carried across the Atlantic in his hands and pressed into the soil of the Flint Hills in the summer of 1872. He had not fought the winter. He had stepped beneath it. He had built his house in the one place where the cold had never reached, where the slow, ancient patience of the earth held its steady temperature through every storm that the sky could produce, and he had lived there warm while the world above him raged. The earth held. It had always held. Harlow Denby had simply been the man who remembered to ask it.